Hello, LifeGroup leaders. My name is Gary Briggs. We're going to be in session 12 on page 100 in our quarterly. The name of the lesson is Humble Beginnings. This is our second lesson in the book of Micah. And if you're like me, you're starting to see kind of a recurrence of the same theme as we've studied in Amos and now Micah and some of our past lessons about God's warning and his plea through the prophets to return to him, to repent and change their ways and avoid the judgment that was basically going to be self-inflicted unless they made changes in their lifestyle and started acknowledging God as the one God instead of worshiping the idols. So today's lesson is a little bit like that, but it's kind of a shift also from not only the judgment that's coming and Micah's very clear definition and description of that, but also of future hope of what would happen beyond the exile. And his prophecy was both to the southern and northern kingdoms and what would happen with Assyria and as well as Babylon and the Babylonians. And so it's kind of an exciting lesson. When I first started looking at it, it was a little bit difficult for me to kind of figure out what was the key thought from this. And again, I try to pull back and look at the big picture before I zoom in on the details. And that, again, that approach helped me today. I guess there are kind of two key points I wanted to start off with in the discussion here would be, and we see that kind of resonates throughout the verses. We actually have verses in chapter 4 and then in chapter 5. But key point number one is nothing happens by coincidence with God. Every detail he has planned out. There's no coincidence. There's no, things don't just happen by chance. And we see that he's very detailed in what happens today in the verses we'll look at. And then the second point that kind of tags along behind the first is that God arranges all these details and all these events really to display his power and to display that he is in control and sovereign over everything, over all creation, the events of mankind, what has happened in the past, what will happen in the future. And that comes out today as we see in Micah's prophecy. So and my wife kind of reminds me sometimes when I read the lesson and the way my brain works, and keywords or certain words will trigger thoughts, and I go off down rabbit trails. So forgive me in advance here. I'll probably take us on a little bit of a rabbit trail today, but I see one word that just jumped off the page. In fact, it's in the middle of our verses, chapter 5, Micah 5, verse 2, the word Bethlehem. And of course, that brings about lots of ideas. I mean, it's almost Thanksgiving Day. After tomorrow, it'll be Christmas. The way time flies so fast, and the whole Christmas story. And here we have in today's lesson, Micah predicting and prophesying what will come out of this little village, probably the most famous village in the world, a little village of Bethlehem. And he talks about that. So there are some very key things that I wanted to point out, or maybe just suggest you might consider when you prepare your lesson about what is going to happen and what Micah is saying in today's verses. I'll just read the verse 2, Bethlehem, and I can't pronounce Epaphah. And in fact, I'll stop right there. Apparently there were two villages named Bethlehem. So one was pretty close to Jerusalem. The other one, the one we're talking about today, is about 70 miles, something like that Mary and Joseph went to, as we know. And so he had to be very specific and very clear in his writing here. You are small among the clans of Judah. One will come from you to be ruler over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity, from ancient times. So most of my thoughts today are kind of going to actually look at that and encompass that one verse. All the previous verses and the ones that follow are pretty much a result of that one verse today. So we'll look at some key takeaways from this prophecy about a person, which we know now that we're on this side of the cross and Jesus and his birth, death, burial, resurrection, and what has happened. We can look back, and this was written like 700 years, if I remember right, before Christ's birth, and this prophecy that one would come from this little village of Bethlehem. So one of the things that made me think of the Christmas story in Matthew chapter 2, and I would suggest you look at that and maybe consider even reading that, but we know how that prophecy was fulfilled. And I've got it open here in my Bible. Let me just read that real quick. And after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" And that is they probably didn't realize the impact asking King Herod. He thought he was king of the Jews. He had been placed there by Caesar to be king over the Jews. And here the Magi are asking him, who is this other person who is king of the Jews? So I'm sure that caused some, we know it caused some anxiety. He was apparently a very paranoid type king from what we hear from history. And they said, "We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them, where the Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem, it didn't take them a split second, seems like, to respond, because they knew where from the Old Testament. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. Well, the prophet here they're quoting in verse 6 of Matthew chapter 2 is Micah, right out of the verses in today's lesson. It says, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." So it's interesting to see how the 700-year prior to Christ's birth prophecy from Micah was tied right here to this story in Matthew, kind of part of the Christmas story about Christ's birth as the Messiah. So that one verse, again, verse 5 of, chapter 5, verse 2 in Micah has several things. And I wanted to, again, offer up 4 kind of bullet points that we might talk about in our class. I've written them down here somewhere on my paper. Here we go. Kind of a good outline, 4 P's. The first is place. It talks about the place where this one will come and be the ruler, which we know is Christ, the Messiah, and that place is Bethlehem. Interesting to me, and I'd forgotten, I think, that King David was also born in Bethlehem. We know Jesus came from the lineage of David and the tribe of Judah. The second is the person. We know who the person is now. It just says in verse 2, one will come. It didn't describe exactly who the one would be, other than the description, he would be ruler over Israel. So we know that one person would come from the small village of Bethlehem there. Number 3 bullet point I put down was the purpose. And we see, and I've mentioned, in fact, Herod referenced the title given, the King of the Jews. And it is kind of interesting in the prophecy in Micah about the King of the Jews. There are these details that we're talking about were all kind of run together in one verse. There's no real delineation of time, the time element of when Christ would be born, when he would be king, and so the people, even I think King Herod, they thought it was maybe more of an immediate type of of thing. That's why he was so concerned. He was paranoid, King Herod, that he would be removed as what he thought was the king of the Jews and replaced with another king. And we know the rest of that story, where he actually had the young baby boys in the town of Bethlehem and the surrounding community killed. And then the fourth P I put down here was pre-existence. That word in verse 2, his origin is from antiquity. And if I understand the meaning of that, the plan that God had for Christ to be born in Bethlehem predated David, the lineage, even the town of Bethlehem. This was from eternity past. God had this plan, and this wasn't just a coincidence or by happenstance or chance that Christ was born. All the events that led up to this, as we know, again, kind of stuck on the Christmas story, but that's what came to mind with the census that hadn't been taken. The reason Mary and Joseph went there to this town and traveled to be at the right place at the right time. Again, we don't serve a God of ambiguity or of happenstance. This was very clear, and the reason these details, I think, were given by God through Micah in this book was so that when that happened 700 years later, there would be no ambiguity. There would be no doubt that for Christ to be born, for all of these things to happen, to fulfill prophecy, wasn't just by luck or chance, or it was definitely planned by God. So this prophecy is very descriptive, very recognizable. We saw that back again in Matthew, the chief priest and the teachers of the law, they knew immediately the answer to the question where he was to be born, and they quoted Micah. So they were expecting a king. Now their definition of what they wanted the king to be, we know, was different than what God's plan was for the king. So there's just a few details there in today's lesson I thought I would throw out, maybe that you can consider for some discussion. It goes on down and describes the type of king. He says in verse 4, he will stand and shepherd them. We know Christ himself talked about being the good shepherd to his people, and that's what he, and even back to where David was a shepherd, and the whole symbolism of being a shepherd who cares for their flock, and we are the flock. Talks in verse 5, he will be their peace. We know that peace be with you. So many times the word peace is used by Jesus in the New Testament to give us peace and rest. So it's very descriptive of the type of person that would fulfill this prophecy. His leadership style, his character traits are all displayed there in the lesson today. So a few thoughts there to maybe consider. If you wanted to go further with that, we know a lot of prophecy in Isaiah chapter 11 is where it talks about the son of David, the royal line, and again that's make reference to Bethlehem and the tribe of Judah. We know in Isaiah is also other supporting prophecy about being born of a virgin and being called Emmanuel, which is God with us. We know in Psalms, there's, I think, chapter 72, if my notes are right, talks about foreign kings will bring gifts. So that's the Magi that we talked about in Matthew. And then we see and know about King Herod and what he did and how that was a fulfillment there of prophecy later on. So give you my so what, kind of in summary here of what thoughts I had with regard to today's lesson. Number one, we serve an amazing God. When I look at what he did and what he prophesied through Micah and Amos and the other minor prophets we've been studying, it's blows my mind how detailed God is and how he loves us so much. He left nothing to chance. He provided a way. So we know Jesus is coming back, and he indeed will be the King of the Jews and will reign as King of the Jews. But the good news is he's also the King of the Gentiles, and that includes us. So we're grafted in there, as we talk about. And then the final takeaway is obviously we can trust in his salvation plan only if we put our trust and our faith in him. So hopefully that's some ideas to consider as you prepare for the lesson. It's pretty straightforward, a lot of good detail, some good conversation points within the class there if you choose to go that route. So hopefully that will help. Thank you and have a good week.